Someone had posed this question on this channel that how do we explain to someone who asks us what is the purpose of a humanistic education in the 21st century? I never got around to answering the question, partially because there is no convincing answer to that. But in today's conversation, I would like to offer my opinions about this question. So let's try it. So, what got me thinking about this question was because I just edited an article that I had written years ago for my Substack, which will come out tomorrow. And that was about the value of a humanistic education within the context of Pakistani educational system. So, what's the value of humanistic education? And of course, my views are not necessarily purely mine. These are derivative. I've derived these views over years through my readings and exchange with others. So if you have to answer this question, usually, as we teachers do as well of literature, is our first answer is always utilitarian, because a person who's asking us this question could be someone who wants to know what's the value of a humanistic education for their child, or for someone who they are sending to college or to a prestigious school. So you have to connect it to the utility of humanities. And what is the utility of humanities? That it enables to train, in Gayatri Spivak's words, our imagination, and it hones our critical skills. And if we have well-developed critical analysis skills, we can apply them to real-life situation. We can apply them to jobs that we might do in the future. All of these are utilitarian arguments because they tell us here is the consequence of studying humanities. Here is how you will be able to use these skills and this knowledge. But beyond that, as a student of humanities and as a teacher of humanities on a deeper philosophical level, I rely on quite a few scholars and theorists who have talked about the value of humanities. So, for example, Spivak, in one of her books, Other Asias, she talks about the purpose of humanities, and she says, and I quote, is to train the imagination of our students. In what way? So, to train it to think about their own lives wherever they are, but to also think of the others at the other end of global divide. So how would we go about doing it? So if we are in an American classroom, we will teach our students here to think about others, right? To imagine and think about those whose lives might be impacted by our actions here in the United States and the actions of our government. On the other hand, in the global periphery, we can also teach our students there to think in democratic terms, to think how their lives could be better if they had a more representative, more responsive system. So to train the imagination of our students. How do we do that? Here, I just ended teaching Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist. I could have taught it simply from how to decipher it and interpret it from a purely American perspective. But because of, let's say, my cultural knowledge and my training, I was able to encourage my students to think of the characters and their experiences within the context of their own histories and cultures. And maybe through that novel, even though they've never visited Pakistan, they might be able to develop what another former colleague of mine would consider an empathetic way of looking at the others. So another thing the humanities and humanistic education can do for us is it can help us in becoming more empathetic to others, even to people with whom we may not have much in common. So, a humanistic education can then help us become more caring, more empathetic, and more responsive to the needs of others. And that also has a utility. I mean, in terms of your jobs, if your approach to dealing with people is more nuanced, and if you can look at them within the context of their own actions, maybe you'll be able to understand them better. Maybe you'll be able to help them better. But on a human scale, if we can think of other human beings within the context of their experiences and feelings, then we can be more responsive to their needs, right? We can be more compassionate. And that to me is one of the greatest attributes of a humanistic education. Now, my dear friend and a great scholar on critical pedagogy, Mark Brocker, in one of his books, teaches us that literature has another function, and that is that it helps us empathize with people that we may not know, but whose experiences could be similar to us. So if I'm reading a novel set in Africa about the experiences of a young woman there, let's say Flora Nawapa Zefuru, I might have never visited that country. I'm not a woman, but through careful discussion of the feelings of the character in the novel, not their thoughts or actions, but feelings, we can then encourage our own feelings to develop. And that also leads to empathy for others. Now, these are, some philosophical, some utilitarian arguments for a humanistic education. But these days I'm teaching at high school and I'm seeing what else can a humanistic education that requires careful reading, note-taking, and writing about literature can do within the current climate of AI and this scrolling of Facebook and, TikTok and others. Our students, most of them are addicted to that. And when we break that through a literary work, through an engagement with a literary work, I think it creates a space in the classroom, but in their life also, where they have to do the slow work, where they have to dwell on something, understand it. And it kind of takes us to that whole formalistic argument that the purpose of literature is to slow down our progress through it so that we can pause and reflect, right? To have that estranging effect. So what is the estranging effect for our students these days? They are so used to fast-paced viewing, scrolling for the next good video. Literature forces them to stop, to think in a different paradigm, paragraph to paragraph, right? Sentence to sentence. It tells them, oh, I need to go back to figure out where I am in the story. When did this happen in the novel? Even when we give them quizzes or journals, it forces them to look at a text in holistic terms, right? To understand its parts and then to realize that they have to go through it carefully in order to grasp what it is trying to do and then reproduce it or maybe write about it. So I think that in today's world, this slowing down of expectations and delving into a text slowly, methodically, with a fair degree of attentiveness is the major function of literature, because it breaks us out of the everyday habits of constant consumption of images and materials, and encourages us or forces us to slow down and learn to enjoy the written word, the art, at a slower pace. And maybe that will help us reduce the general anxiety that we all feel in this fast paced world. So, that to me, currently, I think is one of the main and major functions of literature. So, overall, I mean, if we were to sum it up, if you were to answer this question, and I've not done a convincing job of it, you could go to a totally utilitarian answer which says, hey, literature develops critical skills which are useful in any job, which it does. And then you could go to the philosophical aspects of it, where you can suggest that engagement with literary texts and with characters from different parts of the world enables us to be more sympathetic to others and to have more empathy and compassion. And then, more importantly, it can also help us in this fast pacing world of scrolling and images to slow down and to learn to grasp things, understand them, and maybe in the process develop our mental capacities, but also the capacities of our emotions and empathy and care for others and for this world, and even care for ourselves. So that's all I have to say. I hope it partially somewhat answers the question. As I started, I said, I don't have any convincing answers. But let me know, what do you think? Obviously, we all think about these things. So I would love to hear your views, read your comments, and, I'll be delighted to learn from you. That's all. Stay safe, take care, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.